For a second lesson this morning, 2 verses from the Gospel of Mark, the 6th chapter. As soon as they had finished what they were doing, he made his disciples embark and cross the sea to Bethsaida ahead of him, while he himself dismissed the crowds. After taking leave of them, he went up into the hills to pray. It was now late and dark, and the boat was already well out on the water, while he was alone. Let us bow for just a moment. Amid the distractions and attractions of this world, we pray, grant us moments of quiet hearing of a word beyond any human word that may be to us wholeness, life. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. Bill McKibben describes our times this way. A man walks into a room, fumbles for the remote, and turns on the television. This, he says, is the quintessential act of modern life. It obliterates the 3 rarest comedies of our age: silence, solitude, and darkness. Weather 100 times a day, Sports Center, CNN, People, WGN. You give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world. MTV, no drifting away into reverie, too busy counting thighs. Enough Sunday paper to last until evening. Blockbuster Video, the Comedy Channel, the op-ed page, the Sharper Image catalog, the computer bulletin board, the phone in the car, in the plane, in the toilet, the fax unrolling, the paper chirping. So much for silence. Russell Baker, the author, complains that the number of places where a person can escape the cacophony of sound becomes smaller every year. It used to be, he writes, that a man could go to his dentist and count on some undisturbed suffering which would help him grasp the shortness of life and the agonies of the flesh. No longer. Nowadays, while the drill bites his nerve endings, he will be entertained by an invisible orchestra performing the march of the wooden soldiers through a hole in the ceiling. But don't you find it so? We live in a world which has banished silence. When was the last time you found yourself in absolute silence? As I wrote these words, the phone rang at least 10 times, a 747 flew overhead, the trucks at the Jewel groaned and honked, and there were footsteps above. I work in the basement. So what you say? Well, it is interesting how the biblical story over and over again remarks that silence is of real consequence to any life of reflection, of meaning, of relationship to God. Psalm 46 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Isaiah 30 insists, "In quiet is your strength." Psalm 37 advises, "Be still before the Lord." Why the concern with silence? Quiet, being still. For starters, I think it's exceedingly difficult for us to create and maintain any kind of inner peace and tranquility, and thus function effectively and intentionally in life when we're constantly bombarded with external stimuli, sounds, and sights. A central quiet and serenity in the midst of life's tasks and troubles that enables us to maintain a good mind, a sound mind, and sense of perspective. You can sustain that only if you create some moments, some time, some hours, maybe even an occasional day of relative quiet. Susan Smith Jones, author of Choose to be Healthy, writes, "Those people who live in a constantly noisy environment and who neglect to go inside into their temple to listen to the silence are depriving themselves of one of life's most profound experiences. Unmitigated loudness breeds agitation, aggression, disharmony. Noise deafens the mind to the inner voice, to our connection to all of life, to peace and joy." Science has determined that noise is pathogenic, that it can cause disease in the human body and not just in the inner ear. William Stewart, former Surgeon General of the Public Health Service, once stated that the noises of 20th century living are a major contributory factor in deaths that occur daily from cardiovascular problems. Noise must be considered a hazard to the health of people everywhere, he says. So why do we become so addicted to it? Why do we turn on the TV when we enter the room, the radio when we get in the car? Now, a measure of this may be quite innocent, a form of company when we're alone, a source of information and entertainment. But when it is constant, moreover when we're uneasy without it, when we have to have some background noise, something more serious may be going on. I had an 18-year-old tell me not too long ago that she could not drive her car without the radio playing rock. And she meant it. I dare say you've heard it. Through solid glass at street corners, booming away in the hot auto sitting next to you. Is it a form of distraction from thought? Thoughts that we might find troubling or challenging or painful from thought in any form? We seem to live in a sensate world today where raw feeling trumps reflection every time, where introspection of any kind is avoided. Is it a form of drug, these sights and sounds that enable us to escape the real world into that of constant beat and fantasy? Perhaps the better way to ask the question is to ask what we're missing in the absence of silence in our lives. I think, first of all, we tend to lose touch with ourselves. It takes some measure of silence to know yourself, to become aware of who you are, what makes you tick, what kind of person you are, and what kind of person you want to become. Know thyself, said the Delphic oracle long time ago. The unexamined life is not worth living, goes all the way back to Socrates. The psalmist cries, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my ways. Where? In the middle of Eden's Expressway? Roaring down the runway at O'Hare? Come to think of it, you might learn something about yourself roaring down the runway at O'Hare. Actor Kirk Douglas recalled an encounter with a hitchhiker that he picked up one afternoon. I picked up a young sailor who was on weekend leave. He jumped into the seat beside me, took one look at me, and exclaimed, "Hey, do you know who you are?" Douglas mused sometime later, I found that a very good question, a question I think I better spend some time on. But normally it does take some time apart, alone with our thoughts, our memories, our hopes and dreams, truly develop a healthy self-awareness so that we can live an authentic life, armored against the fads, the pressures, the seductions of an ever-present media culture that is trying to take you over, that is trying to make you over, that is trying to win you over. A political scientist by the name of Michael Budd, well known in scholarly circles, has a new book out entitled The Magic Kingdom of God. And the reference is to Disney, not deity. He argues quite persuasively, I think, that people are being seduced by a content of squalor that they contemplate with rapt attention. He says that television seduces and immobilizes us through its manipulation of time. Add to television the constant exposure to the web, junk mail, telemarketing, billboards, radio, and the like, and you have a fairly convincing argument that yes, it really is bad. In Budd's words, we are in the midst of a flood, not one that lasts 40 days and 40 nights, but a constant flood with no end in sight. He points out that the average American will spend 13 years of his life in front of the tube. And he adds, ironically, for a political scientist, one would be hard-pressed to learn any demanding skills or competencies, especially spiritual, with the amount of time most Christians in advanced industrial countries devote to their faith. So the late Dr. Carl Menninger down at his institute in Topeka used to urge executives who came there for conferences to, above all else, set aside time to decide where you're going, what your priorities are, what are your ambitions, do you know whether you're going in the right direction, and most of all, do you know who you want to become as a human being? The Chicago poet Carl Sandburg used to say, a man must get away now and then. I go out there and walk and look at the trees and the sky and the lake. I listen to the sounds of loneliness. I sit on a rock or a stump and I say to myself, Carl, who are you? Where have you been and where are you really going? We need to stay in touch with ourselves, who we are and most profoundly who we want to be. And then I think we also need time apart, silence, quiet, on behalf of our relationships. Strange as it may sound, it is in quiet by ourselves that we can restore sensitivity to and feeling for and care about those with whom we walk life's way. Whereas in the noise and hurry and busyness of the occupied mind, we tend to lose touch with the better side of our nature. Donald Spoto in The Hidden Jesus puts it this way. At the end of the 20th century, it seems we've made the noisiest, loudest society in the history of the world, and the most confused. An orgy of noises robs us of portions of our very being. Announcers shout, music, movies, and plays are over-amplified. Traffic becomes noisier every year. Advertisements become more intrusive in the media. The effect of exaggerated sound and constant noise on the central nervous system of humans and animals is only just beginning to be felt. It seems to be a kind of madness, a dislocation of ourselves, and from one another. Related to this, the speed and volume of communication and of travel, all of which is thought necessary because it's possible. We have the information superhighway, the communications explosion, the internet, the ubiquitous probing of the media, asking questions, telling us things to frighten us, telling us things to shock us, telling us things to make us envious. We have constant commentary about just about everything, endless chatter, and that modern artifact, the talk show. A curiosity in itself, for now talk has become a matter of show. Yet despite the incessant noise, and this is his point, as numbing as background music in stores and elevators, there's very little depth and less reality in relationships today. For all the talk, there is precious little communication. One physician tells how he walks alone as often as he can, because I suddenly realize I'm just one guy walking in this universe, and it gives me a perspective on myself and my relationships. When I have no appointments, when I walk in silence, I feel something that must be similar to what the astronauts felt in space. I'm small in time and space and life, and curiously enough, I become more precious to myself, and I have infinitely more to give to those that I really care about. I am certain that Jesus went off alone into the silence of the hills on behalf of his life, together with his disciples and friends. He sent them away so that he could be better with them and for them yet another day. To know ourselves more deeply and one another more sensitively, and then, and most importantly, to know God. Or better put, to stay aware of the reality and presence of that mystery which is the foundation of our lives. I find it provocative how this biblical God is said to be known only in silence. Outer silence, but more importantly, inner silence, where we shut down the chatter and cares, the crosstalk that so dominates our brains most hours, and simply and truly become quiet. Be still and know that I am God. Elijah in the Old Testament is threatened with death by Jezebel, the wicked pagan queen, and he runs all the way from Mount Carmel to Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Ten Commandments. And there on that barren mountain he learns something. A mighty hurricane comes along, splits the mountain, shatters the rocks, but God was not in the hurricane. Then came an earthquake and fire on that volcanic mount, but God was not in the earthquake and fire. But after the fire, in the quiet, came, and here most scholars now agree that the correct translation is this: after the fire came the sound of sheer silence, and in the silence was God. I never really understood those words until a few years ago. Marlene and I were there, at least on the traditional mount, and spent 4 to 5 hours in the pitch dark waiting for the dawn, we heard the sound of sheer silence, the sound of God like I never had before. We meet him when we shut up and shut down, turn off the sounds of this world, and wait in the stillness. That's why some people in this congregation get together every Wednesday at 1:30 and once a month at 10 o'clock on Saturday, just to be quiet. What a useless thing to do. But you know, there are other broadcasts on wavelengths that do not appear on our cable. There are other commentaries that do not appear in the back page of the journal. These natural broadcasts are timeless. The sense of the presence of the divine that has marked human beings in every culture as far back as we can go. Only now we try to buy them, you know, at Borders or from the crystal merchants. These broadcasts are low. They resonate only in stillness, and they're easily jammed. We don't have to be in the woods to hear them, but we do have to take the time to be quiet. And we're past the point in human history where these deep currents of God belong to us by birthright. We no longer live in the desert or behind a plow in the fields of Iowa. We have to fight to block out some of the endless rain of information and entertainment. We have to fight not to turn on the TV, to walk into a room and savor the quiet. To get started, we have to take a longer view and remind ourselves again and again that no one ever lay on his deathbed wishing he'd watched one more episode of ER. I remember visiting one time a friend whom illness had confined to his home for long months, an active man, accomplished in his profession, busy serving in church and community, a man who had found his confinement irritating, not to say exasperating. But over the months, a very interesting change began to occur. As he more and more learned to accept the solitary quiet of his situation, one noticed a certain depth and serenity develop in him. Finally, one day he said it. You know, Gil, if you had said to me 6 months ago that I would one day thank God for this confinement, I would have told you you were crazy. But a strange thing has happened. After I got over the initial frustration and quit fighting it, the loneliness, after I'd seen all the soaps I care to see in one lifetime and turned that thing off, I began to learn a quiet and peace entirely foreign to the likes of me. And there are even times when there's a sense of presence that is almost tangible. I've really come to know that lonely as I often am, I'm not alone. So why do we find it so difficult? Why do we resort to almost any device to avoid the quiet, the silence, the stillness? Partly, I think it's the culture, it's the notion that we have to be busy, if we're not always doing, creating, laboring, chattering, we're somehow undeserving of life, we have no right to draw our breath, we are guilty. Ever notice how we talk about how busy we are? You ask your neighbor how things are going and he'll respond with a litany of things he's got on his calendar. Middle-aged man is seeing his mother off to the airport and he says, "Well, have a good time, Mother," to which she impulsively replies, "Now, you know, John, I don't have time for that." Survey a few years ago asked people, how often do you have time on your hands? 96% said never. And this in a country where the average person watches 7 hours of television a day. We feel guilty doing nothing, sitting in silence, not even thinking. What am I supposed to do? And I suspect we feel out of control. Busy doing, thinking, running, listening, watching is a way of maintaining inner control against what? Our anxieties, the sense of mortality that we encounter if we stop and are still, the sense of dependency. But quiet attention is essential not only for the discovery of who we are and what we are thinking and where we're going with our lives, it's an absolute requirement if we are to allow God to be God. In His presence, we experience our dependency. And that too is part of the good news, because we really know when we face ourselves that we cannot heal all our own wounds and we cannot provide the ultimate meaning for our lives. The source of it is elsewhere. Be still and know that I am God. Sometimes in the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper in the heart, giving strength to weakness, courage to fear, hope to despair. And Jesus was alone. How about us? Amen.